About 3 years ago in 2006, my dad and I moved into our current residence. Looking at the number makes it seem like it happened a lifetime ago, but since you aren't here to hear me wax nostalgic, I'll do my best to cut to the chase and avoid irrelevant details. Hey there, I'm 15 years old and I've been attempting to persuade my parents that our house is in serious trouble for the past few months. Let me tell you, our first several years here were perfectly normal. Actually, I really enjoy being here. There was a significant improvement in the size of my bedroom compared to my previous residence, allowing me to accommodate my gaming setup with ease. I discovered something in our basement in the past few months. However, I'm still not convinced it's real. I could be completely insane. It's highly unlikely that my parents will inquire about the topic I'm referring to. They assure me that I'm being paranoid, which is a good one. I decided that I needed to provide them with proof if they weren't going to believe me, so that they and anyone else who could intervene could see the truth, if that is even possible. Thankfully, for my 14th birthday, my parents had bought me a camcorder. I had mentioned that I was considering a career in video and film production. Before this, I had only used it to make rudimentary home videos with some schoolmates. These consisted mostly of brief footage of us being scared as we walked through the woods. Still, I was able to get some work done without interruption since it was summer break. I can't say that I blame them. I think they probably thought I would be too busy playing video games to bother. Without bothering to get dressed beforehand, I leaped out of bed and grabbed my camcorder as soon as I realized my parents had already departed for work in the morning. My only preparation for making my way downstairs was to throw on a t-shirt, some pajamas and socks. Before standing at the basement door, I double-checked that no one else was home by quickly scanning all of the rooms above. Then I took a deep breath and pressed my palm to the doorknob. It wasn't that I was doubting myself or anything. Rather, I weighed the pros and cons of the situation and decided that the risk was worthwhile in order to establish my claims. With the door ajar, I downed the shaky stairs and with a quick glance to my right turned on the light in the basement. In and of itself, our basement wasn't very noteworthy. Everything was as one would expect, a chilly, rectangular room with concrete floors, walls painted a drab brown, and a ceiling supported and insulated by wood. There were old, dusty washing machines, piles of clean and dirty clothes in various baskets, cobwebs in every corner, and centipedes squirming in the crevices. After descending the stairs, I turned left and entered the basement's more leisurely section. Nevertheless, the only furnishings that could be considered recreational were a plain lawn chair and an old coffee table, which had likely been unused for at least a few months. Regardless, I quickly reached my point, which was the wall across from the patio, set and coffee table. I know you're going to wonder what the big deal is with a plain wall in a second, so feel free to call me crazy if you want. This wall, at least, was somewhat darker in tone than the others. Despite being directly across from it on both sides, it seemed to always have a shadow thrown upon it as if it were a light bulb, and this shadow would occasionally flicker. It's happened to me before, and I just witnessed it happen again. At first, I believed it was all in my head, but after realizing that my imagination wasn't the culprit, I found the whole thing to be the most bizarre aspect of this whole situation. I had previously come down to admire it, assuming that the extraordinary occurrences would conclude there, but I mustered up the courage to touch it. I was trying to make sense of something I didn't understand. The day before, I had seized a broomstick and pushed it up against the wall, expecting some paint chip or material to crumble, so I was primarily curious if there was something I was overlooking, if it was related to the paint or if my eyes were malfunctioning. The broomstick, however, merely passed through the wall. Putting it into words in a way that is both intelligent and thorough is incredibly challenging for me. Just as it sounds, it's both easy and ridiculous. A thick slab of concrete crumbled beneath my broomstick. The object persisted in penetrating deeper into the wall, even as I advanced ahead while holding it in my hands. It showed no signs of resistance. Just so we're clear, there weren't any openings big enough to accommodate the broomstick's width. Despite the level surface, the broomstick continued to sink, as if stuck in quicksand. Then, after giving it some thought clearly insufficient, I reached out to the wall, and as soon as my elbow dipped behind it, I withdrew back. There was no discomfort, no scorching heat, and no insects, Something or someone is poised to seize, bite, or claw me. The shocking nature of it piqued my interest, and I can't wait to find out more. Upon first glance, the wall appeared considerably more ordinary when we initially moved in. Perhaps I had simply failed to notice it earlier. To be honest, I didn't really spend much time down there. Perhaps my words were completely ill-informed. Perhaps I simply hadn't been paying close enough attention to pick up on any changes. When I did it before, it was just my arm. This time, I intended to submerge my whole body. I yearned to cross the threshold and investigate what lay beyond the barrier. Some part of me wondered if it was all a hologram projection, which seemed less crazy than what it turned out to be. In spite of this, I will always consider this to have been one of the most ignorant things I did, but I couldn't help but be curious. Clarification was necessary for me. So I went over to the wall with my camcorder in hand, extended my hand again to check that it was still penetrating, and the outcome was well not surprising. I drew a long breath, released my grip on my shoulder as I continued to descend into my basement, and then gingerly advanced, trusting my gut that the wall would hold. Even as I disappeared further into it, I felt like I was being pushed forward and was about to tumble all of a sudden. The sensation of falling was brief. After a thump, I landed softly on my feet once more. As I slammed into what seemed like another wall or floor, my camcorder slipped from my fingers. I could feel the rough, slightly damp carpeting beneath my feet. Worried that I could have stumbled into an off-limits area of our home, I scratched my head and opened my eyes. Yeah, that definitely wasn't it. When I looked up, nothing made sense. It seems completely impossible. A small part of me had suspected that I might have unknowingly breathed a psychedelic. What I could see ahead of me was a vast, disorganized maze of rooms, corridors, and passageways. As if chosen by a little child, the wallpaper was an abomination, a bright yellow that covered every wall. From an aesthetic standpoint, it was really difficult. So I stood up and looked to my right. There, my camcorder lay unbroken and recording. Before quickly turning around to have a better sense of my surroundings, I reached forward and grabbed it up, placing it back in my hand. What was this location? How had I gotten here, and why was I here? It was the last thing on my mind, but I forced myself to be calm despite the whirlwind of ideas. Keep your cool, that's the golden rule at times like these. Getting worked up about nothing benefits nobody, as the only sound emanating from this peculiar location was a faint, buzzing sound I kept to myself. For the most part, I couldn't help but peek up to see where that annoying hum was coming from. Looking up at a white tiled ceiling with a string of fluorescent lights that were haphazardly positioned, and worse, flickered slightly. "Hello!" A cry escaped me. "Is anybody available?" When I heard nothing, I sprinted over to a nearby wall and began to pound on it. I pushed myself forward, trying to squeeze past the wall like before, but the damp carpet crunched under my feet. Like the other wall, this one was solid, so I hurried over to it and pushed and shoved myself up against it. The realization that I needed to conserve energy for an imminent escape made me pull away from the wall. I tried to make myself comfortable with the idea that I was stuck by picturing all the ways things could go worse, but it made no difference. Captured in this eerie basement space. To get things rolling, I just meandered down the closest hallway to my left. It appeared to be around 200 feet in length, with dozens of halls branching off on either side. All of the rooms had that dreadful yellow wallpaper. Along the corridor I went. Not a sound was missing, not even the buzzing and humming of the above lights. What really got under my skin was the fact that it was the sole sound emanating from this establishment, except from the sound of my footsteps on the damp carpet. In the most insidious way imaginable, it was frustrating. It's incredible how much we depend on sound for solace. I'd only been in this weird space for a minute yet. It felt like hours. "Hello," I shouted again, hoping for some kind of reaction. "Is anybody present? Listen, would you?" There was still no reaction, no noise, no indication of any other human being, just as the last time. To compensate for the terrible quiet, my respiration almost doubled in volume. The small tunnel came to a close as I approached its end. I stumbled into what seemed like a somewhat wider rectangular room, Multiple additional passageways converged in the center, like an intersection, and the fundamental architecture and layout remained unchanged. In the center of the crossing, the lights flickered more intensely, and the buzzing and humming became nearly intolerable. Whoever gave this establishment the go light to open its doors must have been completely insane. Right there at the crossroads, I still hadn't figured out which way to go. What I do know is that I wished I could escape that annoying buzzing as quickly as possible. From my vantage point, I quickly scanned the halls, paying special attention to the one on the left. It wasn't because I was inherently interested, rather, it had a unique selling point. When I said it was different, what I really meant was that it was the dimmest of the four, with just one fluorescent light running the whole length of it. However, I did make a note of something approximately midway down its length, even though the lighting was bad. What appeared to be a single sheet of paper with text printed in red ink lay flat on the ground. With an unmistakable sense of being watched, I cautiously made my way down the corridor towards it, knowing that it was the only telltale sign of other humans being present in this location. As I perused the message, I leaned down to pick it up, but to my horror, I saw that the red ink wasn't ink at all, it was blood. I have no idea how much longer I have to stay here. It seems like days have passed with no relief in sight, and I am terrified. It was as simple as getting home from work, collapsing into bed, and then I found myself here, along with some blood-stained car keys. I noticed this piece of paper lying about in here. Even though I'm not alone here, I haven't seen anyone else since I arrived. Something else than a human being lurks in these corridors. Whatever it is that got the man who had the keys will also come for me if I don't remain silent and hidden. And if you happen to come across this, or even if you don't remain silent and hidden, heaven forbid that whatever it is listens. My stomach dropped as I whirled around to check behind me. However, I could see nothing more than the lights dimming slightly, which had already had me on edge. Despite how ridiculous it seemed, I took everything you said at face value. There was no prank or practical joke involved here, no prankster, no matter how crafty, could have pulled off something like this. There have been countless horror films where the protagonist treats something that is obviously not funny as if it were, and you know what? They meet their demise. Since I had been warned that something savage might be hiding inside of me, the last thing I wanted was to carry around this anonymous note that smelled like blood. I decided to just leave it where it was at my feet and continue down the hall into a chamber with a cylinder form. In terms of architecture and design, it was more of the same. As I inhaled deeply, once again, I readied myself to make my way down the right corridor of the cylinder room. However, my heart froze at the sound of an audible alarm. By extension, the remainder of me remained in the same spot. A deafening screech that wasn't too far away was the source of the noise. Standing there in utter terror, my once inspiring self-assurance swiftly evaporated. At this point, all I could do was pray that whatever it was couldn't see me. I couldn't see anything behind me until I worked up the nerve to turn around, even if the yellow walls and damp carpet remained same. Something about the place became even more foreboding than before, yet that wasn't the cause of the note writer's death. I could now hear the creature, whatever it was, approaching. I quickened my pace somewhat in response to its rapid and agitated footfall. I went from a leisurely pace to a quick stroll, and the terrifying scenario it put me in made me feel like my heart was about to burst. I took a left turn, then another, and then a right turn after booking it down into a broad corridor. This was a true labyrinth of meaninglessness. Even if the buildings didn't make any sense, I was determined that this yellow wilderness would not be my final resting place. The monster let out another piercing scream, but this time it sounded a little different, more euphoric and victorious, as if it had finally achieved something it had been longing for. It wasn't until I heard what happened next that I realized why a dull madman knew he was in for a terrible end. As the desperate, anguished screams of "No, no, no, no" resounded, I was unable to identify the precise hallway or room from which this mayhem was emanating. The distance couldn't have been more than 30 to 40 feet as far as I can tell. Even if I did, I still wouldn't have dared to play hero against an unknown monster. A man's cries for help were drowned out by his own shriek and the sound of bones breaking and flesh ripping. His cries turned to gurgles not long after, and the violent snarling and growling soon overtook him. I was running at this point, my eyes welling up with tears of terror and anxiety. To prevent them from obstructing my vision as I sprinted, I swiftly lifted my fingers to wipe them away. At the very end of one of these, as quickly as possible, I discovered a cramped, nearly closet-sized space. At that point, I made my way to the farthest corner from the entrance, sat down, crossed my knees over my chest, and buried my face in my arms, being very careful not to make a sound, lest I bring that creature over and have something to cry over. My mind has been consumed by the terrifying prospect of my own demise here, of becoming the next casualty of that monstrous creature. Whatever this is, if there are any more living souls confined here, I must seek them out and devise a strategy to finally escape. I sat there in what seemed like safety, staring into the abyss, but in reality, I was more terrified than before. The majority of me honestly didn't care that I dropped my camcorder in the midst of all the commotion of reacting and bolting. I only just discovered it now. From the minute I landed here, grouping points wasn't worth it. I ought to have given the wall my space. I should have kept my mouth shut and not meddled where it wasn't necessary. Despite how powerless I felt, I am aware that my foolish behavior contributed to the mess I was in. The less wise decisions I had taken were irrelevant, now that I was here. Sitting here and mentally checking out was the last thing I needed. If I wanted to survive this ordeal, I had to keep my senses sharp and ready. Then, after gathering my courage again, I got back up and went for it. Even though I aspired to survive, I was still far from being a hero or courageous soldier. For someone whose only want was to remain alive and tell their story, I doubt many would believe them. My steps were stealthy as I made my way back to the entrance to the tiny den, where I peered through the narrow aperture into the wider corridor. However, upon hearing footsteps, I came to a complete standstill. The sound of several rapid footfalls rather than a single heavy one, as if the object in motion were using more than 2 legs. To my left down the hall, they emerged. As far as I could tell, whatever it was about to make a dramatic turnaround any second now. I went back into the den and positioned myself as far away from the entrance as I could manage, but my insatiable curiosity about what was keeping me prisoner in this labyrinth couldn't be stifled. No amount of bargaining or trying to reason with it was acceptable after it had so savagely murdered someone. Sitting here, I could do nothing as it started to make its way down the corridor, getting closer and closer to the den. The sound of its footfall was gentle, but disturbingly frequent once more. Scurrying was a better way to describe it, like a dog-sized spider racing down a hallway. Its nearly tapping-like pace made my skin crawl. As it drew near, I forced myself to breathe in, deeply releasing only when absolutely required. Though I refrained from peering out the door or trying to get a good look, the shape of its shadow on the wall behind the den opening was more than enough to ensure that this experience would remain etched in my memory forever. Its underbelly appeared to be built of a dozen or more long, skinny limbs that moved in sync with each other in an odd, twisted way, like a centipede that had been poorly sewn. Countless more slender and twisted limbs sprung out from either side of a lengthy rectangular frame that extended above that gruesome set of legs. Even if it did have a head, I couldn't identify it. Certainly not one that would be seen in the shadows. Who on earth would want to house such a hideous beast here? Had it been secured, was the escape of the individuals containing it fatal? Is that the reason why nobody came here? Having the answers to all those questions doesn't explain why I don't seem to be the only ordinary person to wind up locked here. In all candor, it was the stuff of nightmares and not just for kids. Just feet away from my den's door is where it came to a halt. Gods old and new were invoked in my prayers in the vain hope that it would remain oblivious to my presence. Whatever it was, the creature's low growl was a marked change from the high-pitched noises it had been producing up until then. With my breath trapped, I felt it shake the wall against which I was leaning. I was unable to utter a word. No matter how much I tried, I could hear every sound. My fear was occupied with suppressing it. I was spared another day because the creature, which appeared to be searching, kept moving forward and rounded a bend down another hall rather than stopping to look in either direction. Until further notice, I jumped out of the den's entrance and sprinted as fast as lightning to the left, using my bare feet to avoid being caught. At the far end of the hallway, I noticed my camcorder on the floor almost immediately after rounding the corner. There were scores of shattered fragments scattered about it after it had been destroyed. Everything I had, even the footage, was gone. At the time, I didn't know if there was a way to get anything useful out of it. When I informed my friend that the short films we made with the tool were for nothing, he's going to be furious. There was little time to lament the passing of my labor, so I pressed on. I took another route back to the cylinder chamber. This time, getting blown to smithereens in the other way was the last thing I needed, with the realization that something far worse than simple starvation or extreme loneliness due to isolation might await me within these walls. I became more vigilant than ever before as I made my way through this incomprehensible expanse. Honestly, I've never minded being alone or in my own space, but never like this. No matter where I went, I saw more of the same. A musty carpet, a white ceiling and walls that seemed to be yellowing. At one point, even the most modest light started playing in the background. I finally came to terms with the fact that it was here to stay. Whatever the case may be, I veered to the left 3 times, then the right 3, and then continued straight for what seemed like about a quarter mile before making yet another left. In my head, I was certain that the monster would never be able to track me down in this labyrinthine labyrinth. However, as I hurried down one of the hallways, I beheld something intriguing at the very end. Something I was hoping would be my escape from this place. The only thing that saved me was to take it easy, breathe deeply, and try to get my pulse rate down to a more manageable level. Returning my gaze to the item that had captivated me, I could make out what appeared to be 2 slender, lengthy projections from the ceiling. Although I was unable to discern finer features due to the object's great distance, I could tell that they were mostly dark blue in color with hints of light brown towards the bottom. "Please just let this be it," I said aloud. In general, I was optimistic with my projections. I foolishly believed that I could scale these walls and escape. However, the truth of these so-called things became more apparent. As I approached them, I glanced up and noticed that my bottom jaw was slightly agape. I was literally only 7 or 8 steps away from these things. From the appearance of it, the tile had been removed, but what protruded from the area looked more like ripped or shattered, giving the impression of human legs. I had sickly presumed that the remaining body parts were scattered throughout the other ceiling tiles. How could I have known it was a dead body? In addition to the filthy jeans and worn boots covering my legs, there was an offensive odor that I had only ever encountered when hiking around the carcasses of animals in the forests near my home. The odor was undeniably of decay and rot. This place, though it had been turned up to 11. In a fit of terror, I looked up and frantically covered my nose with my left hand, trying not to vomit up my lunch. I found myself standing just feet below a mass of decaying flesh that had once belonged to a fellow human being. This was the fate that might have befallen me had I not been fortunate. However, what may have caused this to happen was climbing a skill that the thing pursuing me possessed. Based on its structure, I would assume that this is the case. Yet if that is not the case, then there must be something else in this labyrinth that I needed to be cautious about, and just thinking about it made me feel worse. My attempts to control the gag reflex gave way to the nausea that had worked its way up into my throat. I released my grip, parted my lips, and let the stench of decay waft into my nostrils, spreading like wildfire across the wall. I needed to turn around and run away from it immediately. I mustered myself the will to begin sprinting and figuring out a different route, but the sound of multiple rapid footsteps in rapid succession caused me to immediately reconsider my move. They were approaching from the direction of the closest left turn, so I slammed on the brakes more forcefully than before. That creature was circling back to get me, and the scent of the dead body up above probably didn't help matters either. As a scared fool, I just stood there motionless. If I'm being really honest, I had moments when I just wanted to give up and accept my fate, when I just wanted to die and be done with it. When I noticed one of its legs starting to encircle the bend at the end of the corridor, I was staring at my initial astonishment rapidly faded, a small amount of blood staining the tip, and the wallpaper gave it an eerie black hue that was almost asphalt-like. The fight or flight response activated in me. I knew it was going to have a horrible appearance, so I didn't linger to get a better look. I dove back into my sprint, just making it to the other side of the hall before swerving sharply to the left to enter yet another. As it took chase, I could hear its numerous legs stamping on the carpet and walls, and I thought I heard a scream, a blood-curdling cry. It was now pointless to try to be understated or silent. I attempted to evade the beast by making a series of haphazard left and right maneuvers, but it seemed my attempts were in vain because I remained in its line of sight. Because I was certain that I would succumb to exhaustion long before my pursuer did, I frequently wheezed as I searched for anything: stairs, an elevator, a ladder that could transport me to a higher or lower level. As my exhales got quicker, I started to slow down after a few more twists and turns, always attempting to be as elusive as possible. I broke out in a red face and started to perspire heavily. A small incision started to develop on my side as well. If I didn't discover anything quickly, I was certain that my fate was sealed. It seemed like things couldn't be any worse than the terrible sequence I was in right now, but this other realm had a knack for showing me that I was completely mistaken. In the midst of the creature's relentless pursuit, I blindly turned left, only to be interrupted by its piercing shrieks from behind. My muscles ached and pleaded for mercy as I sprinted down the hall I had just entered, trying my best to maintain my speed. I glanced down at the floor for a brief moment. I couldn't continue indefinitely, not even with adrenaline. But when I raised my eyes to see, I saw a complete dead end. No detours or alternate passageways. Returning the way I had come was my only option. Just a few steps separated me and the wall that blocked my path. My plan to turn around and run back the way I came was thwarted when the monster sprung out from around the bend and grabbed me, sending me tumbling backwards and making me give up as I landed squarely on my behind. Its centipede-like legs extended forward, encircling the wall once more. As I drew back in horror, the monster started to shift its body from around the corner, exposing even more of its hideous visage. Criticism that it resembled a mutant centipede would be disparaging to such a being. It was hard for me to believe that even God could create anything so hideous. Dark, almost black stripes of filthy white patterns ran along the entity's skin, giving it an abnormal appearance that was more reminiscent of scars than of normal anatomy. I felt like a little child in the sight of a mature man when the beast stood to attention. It must have been at least 7 feet tall. Those slender appendages extended around its full body, and they turned in perfect harmony with one another. I presumed previously that one of the men whose screams I heard die belonged to the few that still had blood on their tips. A crisp rectangular form made up the creature's body. I had assumed that the enormous gaping hole towards the top was its mouth, a mouth devoid of fangs and filled with a pitch-black void, but other than that it was essentially featureless. The creature was well aware that it had me cornered. It twisted its mouth in an attempt to smile, but it almost had the muscle structure to pull it off. In any case, it was trying to tell me that I was in a bind. I was going to be its plaything and meal if it decided to murder me in a horrible, excruciating way. There was still a remnant of my will to survive, so I got to my feet and started to back up as the monster lurched forward, its dozens of limbs moving in unison. My reasonable brain told me there was nothing I could do, but I persisted. Nonetheless, I whispered a plea, my hands crossed over my face as I drew backwards, my legs quivering. Just when I thought I was about to collide with the wall behind me, I felt a sharp jerk backward, as if someone strong had just pulled me. Things became more darker as I let out a squeal of pain as my back hit what seemed like a firm carpet surface. When I removed my hands from my face, I found myself in a completely different setting, a library pure and simple. There were fluorescent lights, but they weren't buzzing or flickering. The ceiling was tiled, and the walls were a simple, light brown. The carpet itself also didn't seem damp. It felt like well-kept ordinary carpet. In a fit of bewilderment, I coughed for a few seconds as I attempted to make sense of what had just happened, but eventually it all came together. After all, I had already gone through that wall, the same one that had led me to that yellow death trap, so surely the monster could have followed me. An elderly woman's soothing voice interrupted me just as I was about to tensing my muscles to leap to my feet in response to that one inquiry. "Young dude, are you all right?" Various individuals were staring at me as I turned around the library. Some were reading in lounge chairs, others were at laptops, and yet others were standing next to bookcases. The woman who had spoken was virtually visible to me. I had accurately assumed that she was elderly, given her long grey hair, wrinkled complexion, button-down shirt, khakis and small spectacles. "Excuse me, is this your home?" I said, releasing a couple more hackles. Everyone looked at me as if I were crazy, maybe assuming that I was dreaming. Even though she hadn't seen me go into the library, the elderly woman hurried over to check on me when everyone heard a loud thump and saw that I was lying on the floor coughing. Someone called the cops to come get me and bring me home. I complied because I wanted things to be smooth for everyone after what I had just gone through. But the whole time that my parents were chatting with the police and the library staff were making the call, I couldn't take my mind off of that location or that item. It was already perplexing that I had gone there hours before my parents were due to return. But I swear the whole experience didn't take more than an hour, and I was never asleep or rendered unconscious. It just added to the mystery. Still, I'm putting pen to paper in an attempt to comprehend what transpired to me, even though I doubt it will ever be possible. Even though I know no one will take my experience seriously, I feel the need to share it for the sake of my own sanity. It was neither planned nor enjoyable, but I have my first session with my new therapist next week. I suppose therapy is the result of boring your parents with stories of being trapped in another realm and escaping mutant monsters with inconceivable anatomy, but I've never been much of a fan, although I'm sure my folks will tell her that when we first meet, I have no intention of telling her anything. The one thing I've taken away from this experience is the resolve to absolutely, positively never set foot near that wall again